Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the third week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and David Johnson. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles that we referred to, and further comments from us. I can also be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's January 16th. On this day in 1991, the U.S. attacked Iraq, the Bush I administration, beginning the Gulf War. Bush the first was the first of 4 American presidents to bomb Iraq, the fourth being President Obama. Someone once observed that everything in history happens twice. The first time as tragedy, the second time as farce. There are certainly farcical elements to the American attacks on the Middle East in the current administration, but it seems to me that they are tragic as well. Tragedy and farce were also on display on this day in 2001 when U.S. President Bill Clinton, another bomber of Iraq, awarded former President Theodore Roosevelt a posthumous Medal of Honor for his service in the Spanish-American War. I mean, you have to remember just how crazy the Clinton administration was to put that, I think, in context. What's not in context, of course, is the American history that was being mythologized by President Clinton on this day a dozen years ago. In fact, one needs to know about the American imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century and its comparison with American imperialism in the early 21st century, you might find better from Gore Vidal's novel Empire than you do from any high school history books, which is the source of most Americans' knowledge of what their country has done. We've said for a while here that the poets often get there first, and I think in the case of Gore Vidal's historical novels, one would find a far better understanding of what the history of the United States has been than one would get from most conventional historical accounts. 96 years ago yesterday, on 15th January 1919, Rosa Luxemburg was detained, interrogated, and murdered by right-wing soldiers under the command of German Socialist Defense Minister Gustav Noske. Today, she's remembered around the world for her life and ideals. Born in Russian Poland to a middle-class German family in 1873, Rosa Luxemburg emigrated to Switzerland after completing high school and enrolled at Zurich University. While still a student, she co-founded the Social Democracy of the Kingdom of Poland party and received a doctorate in 1897. The following year, she moved to Berlin and joined the German Social Democratic Party, then the largest and most powerful socialist organization in the world, the party that picked up the pieces in the German government after the First World War. She rose to prominence on the left wing of the SPD, the German Socialist Democratic Party, as a firebrand speaker, journalist, and theoretician, writing works on economics, nationalism, imperialism, war, socialism, and democracy. She was, of course, a contemporary of and frequent critic of Vladimir Lenin. Luxemburg taught at the SPD party school, wrote for party newspapers, represented the Poles and Germans at meetings of the Socialist International before 1914. When revolution came to her homeland in 1905, she returned to Warsaw and endured imprisonment for her revolutionary activities before returning in exile to Germany. In the years preceding 1914 and the outbreak of the First World War, Luxemburg warned frequently of the oncoming crisis of imperialism and the dangers of a catastrophic war. She called on European workers to refuse to take up arms against each other. When war broke out in August 1914, the European socialist parties, who'd long declared their hostility to war and determination to resist it by all means, crumbled and supported their respective government. The SPD, German socialists, voted in favor of war credits in the Reichstag, that is, supporting the Kaiser's war. Luxemburg co-founded the anti-war socialist group, the Spartacus League, named after the Roman rebel slave, with other German socialists. Her anti-war activities soon led to her arrest. She spent the majority of the 4 years of the war in the Kaiser's prisons. From her cell, she produced the anti-war Junius pamphlet, as well as other works, while also leading the underground Spartacus League. Her own party, the SPD, the German socialists, disowned and expelled her and other anti-war activists. In November 1918, after the end of the war, sailors mutinied and began the German November Revolution. The Kaiser was deposed, workers' and soldiers' councils established, and a new government led by the SPD took control of Germany. Rosa Luxemburg was released from prison and returned to Berlin, where she co-founded the German Communist Party on New Year's Eve. Tensions between the SPD and more radical socialist parties boiled over in January 1919. Strikes and demonstrations erupted across Berlin, and armed workers and soldiers occupied the newspaper district and other key buildings in central Berlin, while the leaders of the Revolutionary Committee argued, dithered, and fractured. Meanwhile, the government moved its well-organized regiments of Freikorps, right-wing soldiers formed out of demobilized soldiers led by reactionary officers, positioned outside the city by Defense Minister Gustav Noske, who called himself, quote, the bloodhound of the revolution. The Spartacus Rising, as the government labeled it, was crushed with hundreds of casualties among armed revolutionaries and civilian workers and acts of barbarism by the Freikorps. Leading communists and left socialists were arrested, beaten up, and hounded. On 15th January, Rosa Luxemburg and fellow German Communist Party leader Carl Liebknecht were murdered, and their bodies were dumped in Berlin's Tiergarten. The murderers escaped punishment. Rosa Luxemburg said, quote, the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening, close quote. So you're listening to News from Neptune, a What is Happening edition, and we'll start with David Green. What's happening, David?
Yeah, I would mention that I think there was a nice, about 2-hour film about Rosa Luxemburg's life 25 years ago or so, which I recall watching a couple of times and thinking that I learned a lot from it. I'm not sure, you know, I was somewhat of a different person then than I am now, but I think it's probably still a good film. I mean, I've changed. Hopefully the film hasn't. Anyway.
The film changed you.
Yeah.
That's happened.
Yeah. The other thing I would mention in terms of, in relation to Noam Chomsky, he's done an interview recently with someone who he's done a lot of interviews with, that being David Barsamian
Right.
of Alternative Radio, and he's done another one within the last month or so. That's the current edition of the Alternative Radio weekly program, which is available through iTunes, on podcasts, and so forth. And even if you think you read a lot of Chomsky, or you don't, but if you do and you think that you keep up with it, well, there's always something quite new in the fact that Chomsky really keeps up with the current news, and his analysis is I learned a lot from reading his analysis of what's going on in Iraq and Syria, especially with the various elements, the various Kurdish communities in
Yes.
Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, and his analysis of the history of that of those beleaguered peoples in relation to both Turkey and the Arab world. Also, I would encourage viewers that follow the Israel-Palestine situation to view the interviews that are that Paul Jay is doing with Norman Finkelstein on the Real News
Yes.
Network. There's a total of 8, of which 5 are up now, and I think the subsequent 3 will be up in coming days. And I think it provides a lot of insight into Finkelstein and his trials as an advocate, as a Jewish advocate for the Palestinian cause, and gives a lot of insight to him as a person, which I enjoyed. Someone who probably has influenced me, other than Chomsky, whose work and whose example has hopefully been a positive. I mean, some people would say it's a negative influence on me, but I obviously see it as a very positive one, and he's someone who certainly I've used as a guide to understanding the Israel-Palestine conflict, and still do. His most recent work is called Method and Madness, and it discusses the last decade or so, or 15 years of Israeli incursions and Israeli invasions into Gaza and the West Bank, and the whole political context for it. I think he gives the most insightful commentary on what the motives are for that and why that situation hasn't been resolved. So I'm going to move on here to just some more things that have, maybe more anecdotal things, but things that have annoyed me in recent days, just to put them on the table. Nothing in the American media and in the American government says, I don't respect the intelligence of the American people, like the latest FBI terrorist plot. What we find in Ohio, reported on in this morning's newspaper, is the most recent FBI hatched terrorist plot, luring an aimless youth in Ohio into purchasing some weapons and allegedly planning an attack, something which he wouldn't have had the money for and never could have possibly done by himself. But this is what passes, I assume, that in the offices of FBI agents around the country, while people are putting their feet up on their table and on their desk and figuring out what to do with their time. I guess this is what passes for something to actually do, no less something to actually try to scare the American people into thinking that we are actually under attack. Not that there might not be real things going on out there, as we find in Europe, but certainly this is the latest in many of what are reported as foiled terrorist attacks, but which are really nothing more than FBI plots. Number 2 out of my 3 anecdotal annoying anecdotes. This is a kind of a general anecdote about Bruce Rauner, now the governor of our state. I didn't really do that much research into Bruce Rauner while he was running for office. I voted for Pat Quinn because just the idea that of this manager of equity, of an equity capital management firm being governor just didn't sound like a good idea to me. When you look into Rauner's record, which wasn't publicized, I don't think it was covered at all, especially in the local newspaper. What you find, interestingly, beyond the normal goings on of the way these equity capital management firms make their money off of stripping the assets of companies they buy and so forth. What we find with Rauner is a consistent record of getting government money, of investing in charter schools and vocational schools and nursing homes and prison prison-related mental health programs, all of which ways are which the private sector gets money from the public sector and strips assets from that. And what we find in each of these instances is the activities that Ronner has been involved in, either through his ownership of this capital management firm or his own private investments, is businesses or activities that were plagued by scandal. The most which has been reported on in the Chicago Reader, especially a particularly egregious nursing home scandal, which I know that the Quinn faction brought up during the campaign, but apparently, Ronner really, in terms of the local media, Ronner did not at all have his feet held to the fire in regards to any of these quite serious allegations, or not beyond allegations. Really, reality is really quite a lot of malfeasance and quite a lot of scandalous things that should have disqualified him from any consideration for running our state. And then the third thing, let me just mention, just to get this off my chest, that Barack Obama has thrown another crumb to, I guess, the left, I guess the Democratic Party base, I guess those in the Democratic Party who still want to feel like he's just trying to do some good things. And the latest crumb he's thrown in the last week is telling us that he's going to throw some money at community colleges to make community colleges essentially virtually free. And that's all well and good, but that doesn't create jobs. We've got a post high school group of people working minimum wage jobs, trying to work their way through these 2-year programs without necessarily the promise of good jobs following that. This isn't going to do a whole lot for that. Of course, community colleges should be free. Of course, higher ed should be free. Of course, lots of things should be free. I'm not impressed by the idea, given what Obama's record has been. I'm not impressed. I don't want to. I'm not saying that people shouldn't necessarily support this or make the most of it or take advantage of it, but I would caution anybody seeing that this indicates any genuinely progressive overall program that Obama is bringing us. I think the idea in the last 2 years of his administration will be to lay out a few crumbs, and hopefully that Hillary Clinton or whoever the next nominee is will be able to pick them up and once again seduce the Democratic Party base into thinking that the Democrats actually have something to offer them.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune, a What is Happening edition in honor of Rosa Luxemburg, who was murdered on this date at the end of the First World War. The most revolutionary thing you can do is to proclaim loudly what is happening, said Rosa Luxemburg. And David Johnson will do a little of that now.
Okay. Well, Carl, that was a great little, little account of Rosa Luxemburg's life. What I want to add to that, though, is, most people don't realize that the reason the First World War came to an end was because German workers went on general strike and shut down armaments factories and virtually the whole German economy because they were tired of the war, which then kind of sparked mutinies not only in the Navy, but also lots of soldiers that were fighting in the trenches deserting and going home. And this is something that's never talked about usually. So anyway, I want
to not to mention that the Russians had already laid down their arms in 1917.
Correct.
And
after the revolution,
what it did was prompt the legend, which was quite helpful in later German politics, of the stab in the back. How the German arms were defeated by leftists and others who refused to fight. And Rosa Luxemburg, of course, was one of the examples of the attitudes which the right said had led to to Germany's defeat in the war. So, indeed, yes, I mean, the past is prologue here.
Yes. Also, one other fact about Germany was that there was a successful workers' revolution in the province of Bavaria. Right. During the same time period. I think the guy who headed it was, his last name was Kurt Eisner was his name. And actually it was doing really well, but once the Freikorps got through with Rosa Luxemburg and her comrades in Berlin and other cities, Hamburg and some others, they immediately then surrounded and attacked Bavaria and went on a brutal reign of terror. I mean, murdering anybody that was even remotely associated with the government there. So anyway, and another thing I want to comment too, David, films do change, by the way. Yeah. I had a personal experience that with the film Stanley Carnell's Vietnam television history that was made in the 1980s. I think I talked about this before, but I was shocked when I went to get a DVD version and found it had been censored in many parts. And I had to end up going on Amazon and getting a VHS copy that was originally released in the 1980s. So yeah, that's films do change in this day and age. It's amazing how much censorship and revision of history goes on out there. But anyway, I wanted to talk about the recent killings in Paris, as well as those in Nigeria, which they suspect there might have been as many 2,000 people killed by an Islamic group that operates in Nigeria. One thing that's interesting is, of course, the the corporate media in this country, as well as the media of some of the other allied countries, if you will, the other corporate controlled countries like Britain and France, are really trying to make this a battle on the Islamic religion. Trying to imply that somehow Islam in and of itself creates violence and stuff, and this is just totally ridiculous. I mean, it's just pure propaganda that they're trying to basically fearmonger, hate-monger, and they're doing this so that they can basically get support for two things. One, to expand their wars and control in the Middle East, to control energy resources, and two, to increase the surveillance state against not terrorists, but us, citizens, because that's who they really fear, believe me. And what's interesting is that you've got to realize, I mean, these Islamic fundamentalists just didn't pop out of nowhere. I mean, there's an interesting history here about how our own government, the United States, back in the late 1970s, created these monsters. They created them in order to basically pursue their Cold War battle, if you will, against the Soviet Union, and also to more importantly, probably, overthrow democratically elected governments that actually wanted to do something for their people. Perfect case in point there is the 1953 CIA coup in Iran. At that time, Iran had a democratically elected president that was very progressive, and his mistake was that he wanted basically to get more of the oil revenues that was, oil production was controlled by British and American oil companies. He wanted a greater share for the people of Iran in order to basically increase health care, schools, that sort of thing. But so what happened was the international oil companies, went to their respective governments, the British government and the American government, and basically were able to foment a coup and depose this democratic elected leader and reinstate the Shah, who was basically the monarch who was in exile that had been deposed after the Second World War, his father actually. And then after the Shah was reimposed in 1953, a reign of terror commenced for the next 20-some years. The SAVAK, which was the Shah's intelligence agency, was world-renowned for its brutal murders and torturing of people. But he was the Washington elite and the 1%'s ally. He was he may have been an SOB, but he was their SOB.
And the SAVAK was the product of a noted American institution too, right, David?
The CIA
set it up, right?
Yes, the CIA set it up. And you have to understand that this was one of the things they were doing, coups, and it wasn't just in the Middle East. It was in Latin America, Africa, especially Guatemala and Chile, later in the 70s, also in Africa, in the Congo, later named Zaire, and now again Congo, with Patrice Labunda, who was murdered by the Belgians and the French, a great leader that was actually going to, get more benefits from his people. So you got to understand that all this comes out of the old legacy of colonialism, which basically was, the French, the British, the Spanish, and later on the Americans and the Philippines, basically wanted to control colonies, to basically steal their resources and to take advantage of cheap labor in order to enrich their elites. I mean, it didn't benefit the populations of these countries, the working people, it benefited the wealthy. And it's the same old story. But now come the late 1970s, Afghanistan, we go to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan, it had been ruled since the 1700s by a monarchy. So it was like in the early 1970s, there was a populist revolution that deposed the king at that time, and a new government came into power, which was a really progressive, left-oriented government. And what they did was they basically started hospital clinics. They made university education free. They basically allowed women to not have to wear veils. They could go to the university. They had equal rights. There was even ministers, female ministers in the government. Afghanistan was well on its way from emerging from a feudal, backward country into a more modern, egalitarian country. But it seems like Washington, D.C. Was not interested in that happening. And in 1979, Brzezinski talked President Jimmy Carter, into actually allocating money and CIA personnel to go into Afghanistan, into the remote areas, and find and recruit the most backward Islamic fundamentalists that he could find, encourage them, train them, arm them, and then set them loose on the Afghanistan government, which they began to then attack schools, hospitals, agricultural extension offices, and murder anybody that was participating there as either an employee or as a participant. So, I mean, this is what has happened. This is the whole thing, the history behind where these Islamic fundamentalists came from. So you fast forward a little bit, and eventually our tax dollars poured billions of dollars in arming these various these Islamic fundamentalist warlords in Afghanistan. Eventually, the Afghan government was besieged. They asked the Soviet Union for help, which then happened. Then Washington said, Russia invaded Afghanistan, which wasn't the case. It'd been like if Mexico was under siege and Obama, say, would send in U.S. troops to help the Mexican government, something I wouldn't be in support of, but nevertheless, it's not the same as an invasion from another country. Nevertheless, then began the long Afghan war, in which billions of U.S. tax dollars went into further recruit and arm these murderous terrorist Islamic fundamentalists in Pakistan, who then went into Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. After about 10 years, the Soviets decided they had enough. They pulled out, and a new government came into power in Afghanistan through an election, but that wasn't that government, even though it was favorable to the various corporate interests, it wasn't favorable enough. So there was another coup initiated by Washington and London to install an even more extremist Islamic government. And then what happened, they finally pulled out all the aid money, and then the Mujahideen, which was one of the main groups that they had created, which is the predecessor to the current Al-Qaeda, basically felt abandoned and resented. And then this is when the love affair of Washington and the now Al-Qaeda, then Mujahideen, broke up, and then our current problems pretty much started from there. With attacks on attempt on the World Trade Center in 1993, and then later attacks on the USS Cole, and also embassies in Tanzania and Kenya. But this is what's interesting, is that these were people that our government basically recruited and trained and turned loose to further their ends, and then eventually and because of this, they created some Frankenstein monsters that we're living with today. But what's interesting too is that even after this fallout, there's been cases of most recently with Libya. With the overthrow of Gaddafi, the main fighters who were fighting were Islamic fundamentalists who were basically being supported with U.S. tax dollars. So, you know, the plot thickens here. But in a nutshell, these Islamic fundamentalists that we're supposed to hate, and which we should because they are horrible people, not Muslims, not the religion of Islam, but these people are the equivalent of basically just fanatical killers and fanatics. You know, they're basically we're a creation of our own CIA and our own tax dollars. So here we are, and this is what people need to realize.
Well, it seems that I mean, certainly the constant since World War II has been our support for our reliance on Saudi Arabia, the centrality of Saudi Arabian oil, and our reliance on Saudi Arabian jihadists or the Wahhabi Muslims, as you know, promoting that. There's probably some nuance to be gotten from understanding that in the context of the Cold War and the relationship between Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. And I'm not quite sure how much our support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan preceded. I guess it did precede to a certain extent the Soviet intervention.
Yes, we have Zbigniew Brzezinski's own account of this, and I mean we can't be sure that he isn't lying, of course, but we're talking about the man who was President Carter's national security advisor and has made as a policy intellectual one of the major statements guiding American foreign policy in its account of the attempt to control, essentially, control what he calls Eurasia. That is Russia and environs. Brzezinski said in a famous interview with a Nouvel Observateur in Paris that what the Clinton administration, and make sure we understand that it was a Democratic administration, did in the 1970s.
Carter
administration, that's important. I think I said Clinton a moment ago. Brzezinski was Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and was in charge, according to his own account, of this program of finding these fanatic fighters that David Johnson was describing, and sending them into Afghanistan before the Russian invasion, as Brzezinski said, in order to give the Russians a Vietnam of their own. And now this was Brzezinski, a Pole and an inveterate Cold Warrior, giving an account of the forming of the Islamic extremism, as is now being called, as an act of American foreign policy, an anti-Russian act of American foreign policy. And those anti-Russian actions continue in the present administration, not only through the Clinton administration, where they're very important indeed, but also up to and including the Obama administration, in ways that I mean, we've been reporting about this for 25 years on News from Neptune, and I'm astonished and shocked at what the Obama administration is willing to do in the same direction, and how much more belligerent and risky the Obama administration's actions are in attempt to control Eurasia. And this is bound up directly with the Middle East policy of the United States. And we have Brzezinski's account of how the origins that David Johnson was talking about lie in conscious American policy, and not the American right either, but of American liberals. And when we don't realize that, we don't realize literally where the bodies are buried.
One other thing I wanted to add, Carl, here, I want to just read a little excerpt here. We're going back now to the Afghanistan in the 1980s when the Mujahideen, our taxpayer dollars and the CIA trained and armed Afghan rebels, the Islamic fundamentalists, were fighting the Soviet Union and the Afghan government at that time. It said each time that the Islamic fundamentalists secured more land in their battles, they immediately planted it to poppies. Between 1982 and 83, opium harvests along the Afghan-Pakistani border doubled in size, and by 1984, Pakistan was exporting 70% of the world's heroin. During that time, the CIA stations in Islamabad, Pakistan's capital, became the largest quote-unquote spook den, a spy den, in the world. Golden Crescent heroin output, which is in Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, Golden Crescent heroin output surpassed the Golden Triangle, which is in Cambodia and Laos, just as the CIA had used this opium production and then refinement into heroin and transporting it for funding for their covert operations during the Vietnam War during the 60s and 70s. This now was repeating itself in Afghanistan. And what's really interesting too is that in 1978, the Lieutenant General Fazl Haq was appointed governor of the Northwest Province in Pakistan, where Peshawar became an armed supermarket for the Mujahideen and home to hundreds of heroin refineries. Haq, this Lieutenant General of the Pakistani Army, was one of the largest depositors at the CIA's Bank of Credit and Commerce International, otherwise known as BCCI, which got the nickname Bank of Crooks and Criminals International. He was President Zia's, the president of Pakistan's closest confidant and good friend of Zia's son, who ran the BCCI Karachi branch bank. Haq became de facto overlord for Mujahideen operations and provided protection for the heroin labs. And this one leader of the Mujahideen, Hek Matyar, himself ran 6 labs further south in another province. And this is what the point I'm leading up to here. A State Department narcotics suppression officer based in Islamabad accused U.S. Ambassador to Pakistan at that time, Ronald Spears, of refusing to forward any evidence of Pakistani military officials' involvement in the heroin trade to the DEA, though it was widely known that Haq and others were key players. So we see this same pattern of basically destabilization of governments because they don't want to toe the line of what the corporate interests want, and the drug trade, especially heroin and cocaine. They talk about this war on drugs, but really what it really is all about is eliminate the competition, because there's I don't have the exact figures, but the amount of money that's made every year from heroin and cocaine worldwide is in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I mean, so it's a very lucrative market, and of course the elites talk against drugs, but in fact some of their elements are actually profit from it to finance a lot of their shenanigans, if you will, throughout the world, as well as enriching themselves.
Of course, the Taliban in power in Afghanistan in the 90s suppressed the heroin trade.
Indeed.
And practically wiped it out.
Yes.
And it was only with the American invasion of Afghanistan that the trade came back. I mean, as the earlier incidents suggest, it's the U.S. that's promoting this trade. And of course, there's the major way in which the U.S. promotes the heroin trade, and that's the war on drugs itself. If there were no war on drugs, if heroin or cocaine or just certain herbal remedies that you could even buy over the counter, as you could in America in 1900, then there would be no vast profits to be gained from poppies in Afghanistan. But of course we do have the war on drugs, and that does make it extremely profitable, as you suggest, David, for these things to work. So the U.S. is the U.S. policy is rational if you understand rationality as setting means to ends, finding ways to channel large amounts of money into the hands of the governments and the warlords that the U.S. wants to back. The war on drugs is very good at doing that.
Well, what's interesting, there's lots of video footage out there. In fact, some of it's in Robert Greenwald's series of films about Afghanistan. And I've seen several clips where they're interviewing American soldiers there out in the field. And there's one lieutenant there interviewing is standing right in front of a poppy field. And he actually, and in fact, the person filming him, the interviewer says, "Isn't that a poppy field behind you?" And he goes, "Yes," kind of with a sheepish, embarrassed smile. He said, "We've been given strict instructions to leave that alone because we don't want to upset our the people in this area that depend on this." So it's like a very interesting double standard here.
It's very clear one of the first things that should be done is the war on drugs should be wiped away, and drugs should be decriminalized in this country, as is happening in some places, on some unlikely places like Portugal around the world. You're what? Oh, sorry, David.
No. You can interlude. You can segue here. If
I was just going to say that you are watching News from Neptune, and we have a number of things on the agenda. The story that got me this morning, gentlemen, was the story about the Swiss currency. The Swiss have decided, yes, to take the cap off their currency. In other words, to let their currency appreciate in relationship to the dollar and the euro. Up to now, they'd kept a very strict cap on that, basically to make Swiss exports reasonably priced abroad. Now that they've let that cap off, the commercial interests in Switzerland and, in fact, tourist bureaus are upset because it basically makes Swiss goods and services more expensive to the rest of the world. Now, to try and understand how this works, what's going on here, I think we have to look at the general context of the upcoming elections in Greece and the policies that the European bourgeoisie is trying to exercise throughout the continent with the help and, in some sense, the hindrance of the United States government. It's a complex matter, but I thought the most interesting development is the appearance in the American media, which cannot be taken seriously as an account of what's going on in the rest of the world, as we know, but is always interesting to analyze in terms of trying to decide what it is the American government wants you to believe, usually contrary to the truth and in the interests of the American 1%. The right in America has begun to blame the environmentalists and Russia for the demise of the fracking boom. You know, we've been hearing for the last year or so all this business about how America is going to achieve energy independence because of the wonders of fracking. And a number of environmentalists step up and say, you know, it really does an awful lot of damage, really not a good idea at all. And the oil companies say, no, but look at the wonderful profits we're going to make around the world and the way in which we're going to seize back the control of world energy from OPEC. This is all nonsense, and it's all based on nonsense because, of course, the U.S. is not suffering from a lack of energy independence at all. Rather, a cornerstone of American foreign policy is to control world energy flows, or world energy resources. That's why we're killing people at a great rate in the Middle East. And that's also why we're risking up to and including nuclear war in Europe with Russia. But the sudden decline of oil prices in the last several months, which is hard to separate from an American policy to try to impoverish Russia and Venezuela because they weren't doing what they were told by Washington. This policy has had the effect also of putting a spanner in the works, as the Brits say, for the American fracking industry. So we need a villain. We need someone to blame for the fact that the oil companies are maybe going to make less money than they thought they were going to from fracking. They've arranged to make sure that they won't make less money than they thought they were going to from fracking, but they do have a villain, someone who's, when things go bad, when the economic situation of many Americans decline as a result, it is said, of the decline in oil prices, we know who did it. Those environmentalists who got in the way of the wonderful fracking system, and Russia, who was backing the environmentalists. Just amazing. We haven't heard stuff like this since McCarthy days. But it does suggest an amazingly dangerous financial arrangement that was made by the Obama administration, by the Democrats and Republicans in the Congress, that could cause us all sorts of trouble. Wall Street is now flooded with fracking industry derivatives. These are essentially contracts that protect the profits of oil producers, and they've gone so far as to sneak in the wee hours of the morning of the day in which the supposedly must-pass cliffhanger omnibus budget bill was approved. They slipped into a provision which would cause taxpayers to pick up the tab for any losses that would be suffered by the decline of profits from fracking. I mean, that doesn't sound possible, but remember, we did it for the banks, and now we're going to do it for the oil companies. It's really quite remarkable. The Congress wrote into the law a provision that in the case of insolvency, the financial institutions that were guaranteeing the profits of the oil companies, what are called derivative contracts, these financial institutions could simply take over the deposits take over the assets of the depositors to pay off those oil companies. I mean, it sounds incredible. You say the bank, you put money in a bank, and the bank says, look, the oil companies aren't making enough money from fracking, therefore we're going to take the money that you put in our bank and give it to the oil companies. This is exactly what's happening with these derivative contracts. Even has a new name. It's called a bail-in. Rather than a bail-out for the banks, this is a bail-in for the oil company, for the banks and the oil companies. But this time they're using your money directly, including the money that you put in the bank. Also taxpayer money, as they did last time as well. It's quite a remarkable arrangement, and it's complex, but it's also bound up with the things we've been talking about this evening in Europe and Asia and in the Middle East, with America's Middle East energy policy and the policy of belligerence that the U.S. is exercising around the world in ways that are simply the modern version of the century-old colonialism that David started the evening talking about. This business of, I mean, you wouldn't think that they'd be quite so, the government and their trained media would be quite so crass about this, but I'm relying here primarily on an article written by one Andrew Higgins in the New York Times, the headline of which was "Russian Money Suspected Behind Fracking Protests." Now, this is the New York Times telling you that if you hear these people who are saying things that, say, the Keystone XL pipeline and so forth are bad for the environment, what you're probably hearing are Russian agents telling you that who are trying to pull down America's energy independence, which fracking, of course, is.
So let me understand this correctly, Carl. There's people in a lot of rural areas across the country where there's fracking being conducted, and of course these communities are all upset because it's harming their drinking water and everything else. So I guess these people all of a sudden become environmentalists, these rural, hardworking people all over. I mean, out in the Central West, out in Pennsylvania, even in Southern Illinois, beginning here of late. All of a sudden, they're environmentalists who are actually supported by Russian money. I mean, what an outrageous statement.
Isn't that amazing? And as I say, it sort of slipped into the New York Times. While the New York Times is writing interesting editorials about whether torture should be prosecuted. I mean, they have written some interesting editorials about that. While the New York Times is doing that, they calmly say, by the way, if you think there's some economic problems about oil, well, there is, but that's because the Russian agents are doing it. And this is part of the administration's Hate Russia campaign, which is completely falsified as you've pointed out here before, David, what's going on in Ukraine and what the United States is actually doing vis-a-vis the European economy and the Russian economy. So, I mean, trying to get an accurate account of what American policy is extremely difficult. Perhaps more difficult in this administration than it has been for a while. I mean, there aren't many differences between the Obama administration and the last Bush administration, and what there are don't really redound to the credit of the Obama administration. One of them being the fact is that they're better liars. The Bush administration had a certain bluff dishonesty about it, where they said, "Yeah, we're going to go kill a mess of people in the Middle East. Complain if you want to, but hey, we got to do it." They might have weapons. That's a lie. You said to the Bush administration, "We don't care," said the Bush administration. "We're going to do it anyhow." The Obama administration continues to lie. And says, of course, we're drawing down the war in the Middle East. Of course, we're trying to help the people in Ukraine. Of course, we're trying to help the energy independence for Americans. The lies are replete. And it's quite remarkable the way they're able to get away with it. And one of their methods clearly is the, how did you put it, David? Crumbs, the sop. You do a little thing that looks good, it looks nice, and looks necessary, whether it's Obamacare or 2 years of college education or something, saying, "Hey, look at this nice thing we're giving you." And in the meantime, the real support goes elsewhere. The real support goes to the 1%. The 1% who have, in the Obama years, garnered 95% of all the income gains of those years. It's pretty clear who the Obama administration is working for, both at home and abroad. And the only thing that's not clear, perhaps, is just how immensely dangerous this may finally turn out to be.
You started the segment by talking about Switzerland and their decision to basically raise the value of their currency because their economy is doing well, and to make it easier for them to buy, make it harder for them to sell goods to other countries and easier for them to buy goods, which is what. This is maybe a technical point. Well, it's more than technical. Paul Krugman criticized them this morning in his column, and
I didn't see that
for doing that. Yeah, and Dean Baker, who I respect the most of the daily commenters,
friend of this ground,
was criticized Paul Krugman on his blog, and I think what this debate, technical as it may seem, is getting at what. You see, Switzerland has its own currency. It still has its own currency.
It's
not the euro. Nor do countries like Denmark and Norway and Sweden that are doing relatively well. Neither are they. Do they use the euro? They're able to control their own currency. And what a sensible country does is doesn't when they use the value of their currency to live within their means, so to speak. And if they're doing well, then they acknowledge that. And if they're not doing well, they acknowledge that by lowering the value of their currency to put their people to work, which is what we should be doing in this country. And I think this goes in the background. It wasn't I didn't read the Krugman column. I read Dean Baker's response to it. But I think in the background of this is Greece. And the possibility that it will take control, that it will leave the euro and take control, for better or worse, over its own currency. And by worse, I mean the fact that there will be suffering. Certainly, if they leave the euro, there will be a certain kind of suffering involved, a certain transitional period involved. But it seems to me that all a country can do is live within its means the best it can, and take care of its people the best it can. And the euro system hasn't allowed southern European countries to do that because it doesn't control its own currency. So what we're going to see is an election in Greece this month, with the possibility that the leftist party, Syriza, will be put into power, and with the possibility that they will leave the euro. So there's a lot at stake here in terms of the country, and I think that I'm not saying that what happened in Switzerland directly relates to this, but it sounds to me like it it might frighten some people because it gives because as a government, I mean, as a government of obviously a rich country, maybe it's easier for them to be generous, but they're setting an example that obviously Germany, which is behind all the austerity in Europe, doesn't like.
I think that's very true. And what the economic danger that the American government and its allies are most worried by is the threat of default. The notion that Greece or even Russia might not pay the bankers the money that they owe them. And these countries know that. I mean, the actually very gently leftist Syriza party in Greece has already said, oh, we're not going to do that, but we do want a better deal. Well, they want a better deal in part because that threat is always there. And for all the U.S. continues to try to destroy essentially the Russian economy, a policy that goes back to the fall of the Soviet Union, and of course many years before. The Soviet Union always retains the possibility of not paying its bills to European bankers, not paying its debts to European bankers. So there is a dance going on here between these countries, where the United States, for example, puts sanctions on the Russian economy and pushes it as far as it can, knowing that there is sort of a firewall down there at one point where the Russian government says, okay, we're out of the game, we're not paying. And that's the real argument, and the argument it has a great deal to do with politics around the world, because it has to do, for example, with the Russian arrangement with the Chinese, which has been developing remarkably in the last year and so, as a result of the American attacks. There's an old motto that grew up in the days of the anti-war movement amongst students for a democratic society, which was everything is connected. And there's a certain naivete to the motto, perhaps, but there's enough truth in it for us to begin to realize that the accounts we get of world politics, the accounts we get of American policy, are usually lies, because these connections, indeed, are not attended to. And our job here, as the Rosa Luxemburg said, is to proclaim loudly what's happening. You're watching News from Neptune, and our time is about up. I want to mention one last point. Did you see that a wonderful example of identity politics versus class politics, in that challengers have appeared for Kashama Sawant, there we go. The socialist member of the Seattle City Council, challengers from the LBGT movement and from the feminist movement. Now, I don't have a particularly suspicious nature, but I know immediately that these folks are put up by anti-socialist elements. This is a socialist city councilor, who are playing on diversity, saying, "Oh yes, we need more diversity here." She's not really diverse enough. Well, she's not. What she actually is a socialist, and that's why she's being opposed.
She's a woman of Asian background, for crying out loud.
Well, yeah, but that's not enough diversity. Diversity is a way to challenge any opening towards socialism, and that's really what's at stake here. You have been watching News from Neptune for the third week of the new year, 2015, a What is Happening edition in memory of Rosa Luxemburg. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and David Johnson. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 with David Johnson, and more news from outside the bubble, as Harry Shearer says, that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.